Hitler at first refused to discuss the sequence of the operations I was proposing. He would not admit that there really were powerful forces advancing through the area between 1st Panzer Army and Army Detachment Lands. He also feared that the operations I envisaged between the Dnieper and the Donets would become bogged down in the mud. As the winter was already quite far advanced, this was naturally a possibility to be reckoned with. But the main reason for Hitler's negative reaction was most probably the wish to recapture Kharkov at the earliest possible date, which he hoped would be when the SS Panzer Corps had assembled its full complement of divisions. In fact, the situation was such that a prior condition for any stroke in the direction of Kharkov was the removal of the threat to the Dnieper crossings. Unless the communications across this river were kept open, neither 1st Panzer Army nor Army Detachment Hollet could remain alive. For the stroke at Kharkov, moreover, the cooperation of at least a part of 4th Panzer Army would be needed. Since it was certain that when the thaw finally put an end to operations, it would do so in the region between the Donets and Dnieper before it affected the country around and north of Kharkov, one could reasonably hope that we should still have time to attack at Kharkov after we had beaten the enemy now advancing between 1st Panzer Army and Army Detachment Lands. On the other hand, it was more than doubtful whether the two operations could be carried out the other way round. Because of the obstinacy with which Hitler invariably clung to his point of view, another interminable discussion ensued. I finally put an end to it by pointing out that as the SS Panzer Corps must in any case first assemble on the Kharkov-Krasnograd road, which it could not do before 19th February at the earliest, the final decision on whether to go north or south need not be taken till then. This dilatory approach of mine was made possible by the reflection that 4th Panzer Army could not be available before 19th February either. I also felt justified in assuming that Hitler would be brought to reason by the course of events which he was now experiencing at first hand. On 18th of February, I saw Hitler again. The enemy had attacked in strength on the Mius and penetrated at several places into the as yet unconsolidated front of Army Detachment Hollet. Furthermore, it had still not been possible to destroy the enemy cavalry corps encircled behind this front at Debaltsevo. I submitted to Hitler that in spite of this, it was still urgently necessary to withdraw motorized units from here to the Western Wing, even if it were not possible at that particular moment. The enemy mechanized corps in the deep flank of 1st Panzer Army at Grishino was not yet defeated either, so that the forces committed there were still tied up. On the other hand, there was now incontestable evidence that the enemy in the gap between 1st Panzer Army and Army Detachment Lands was indeed advancing in force against the Dnieper crossings. His 267 Rifle Division had been identified south of Krasnograd, and he had taken Pavlograd with 35 Guards Division, which included a tank battalion. An Italian division located there, one left over from the former Italian army, had hurriedly pulled out on the approach of the enemy. Army Detachment Lance had reported that the wheeled vehicle units of the Death's Head SS Panzer Division were completely bogged down between Kiev and Poltava. This washed out the northward stroke to retake Kharkov, which had been Hitler's primary concern. If the SS Panzer Corps had not even been able to hold the city without the Death's Head Division, it was less likely than ever to recapture it when the latter's availability date could not be anticipated for the time being. The only thing we could do, therefore, was to strike southeastwards and destroy the enemy advancing through the gap between Army Detachment Lance and 1st Panzer Army. Since the thaw must be expected in that area too, in the very near future, there was no time to lose. In the circumstances, Hitler agreed to my idea of immediately committing the Reich Division as the first available formation of the SS Panzer Corps in the direction of Pavlograd. The Leibstandarte Division was to provide 4th Panzer Army's operation with cover against the enemy pushing hard southwards from Kharkov. At all events, it was now to be hoped that 4th Panzer Army, reinforced by the Reich Division, would be successful. Following this decision, I put my view to Hitler on the situation generally. I pointed out that even if we managed, and it was far from certain that we should, To avoid any unfavourable developments until the muddy season set in, I still had to think ahead. The mud would not give us a break of more than a few weeks. After that, the Army Group would have a front of 470 miles to hold, for which, inclusive of the forces of Army Detachment Lands, there were 32 divisions available. On the other hand, it could be taken for granted that once the muddy season was over, the enemy would again direct his main effort against the German southern wing and go all out to encircle it on the Black Sea. A front of 470 miles, defended by only about 30 divisions, I told Hitler, could be pierced by a stronger enemy at any point he liked. Above all, no one could prevent him from steadily outflanking the Army Group to the north until he reached the Sea of Azov or the Black Sea. Once the muddy season finished, therefore, the Army Group must not remain stationary until the enemy broke through somewhere or outflanked it in the north. It could only afford to stay where it was if OKH were able to launch a well-timed offensive stroke to relieve the pressure on the front, which still projected a long way eastwards. My purpose in putting forward these ideas was to persuade Hitler to consider operations on a long-term basis for once. It was obvious, however, that he had no intention whatever of committing himself. While admitting that the Army Group's forces would be too weak to defend that front in the coming year, he would not accept the ratio of strengths I had given him. He did not dispute the presence opposite us of the 341 enemy formations we had identified, but contended that they were no longer of any value. When I objected that our own divisions were also at the end of their tether, he replied that they would be brought fully up to strength and issued with new weapons during the muddy season, which in point of fact they were. He would not recognize, however, that during that same period the enemy would bring his 1926 class of 1.5 million men to the front. Neither would he admit that with the number of tanks the enemy could produce in 2 months, i.e. the approximate duration of the muddy season, he could refit about 60 armoured brigades. Instead, Hitler was at pains to emphasize the decisive importance which the Donetsk area would have for Soviet tank production if it were once to fall back into enemy hands. As for Germany's own conduct of operations in the east in 1943, he could not take the forces for a large offensive from any of the other theatres, nor could he find them from newly drafted units. On the other hand, he did think that it would be possible to take limited and localized action with the help of new weapons. This brought Hitler right back to the subject of weapons and weapon production, and it proved impossible to pin him down on his intentions regarding the coming summer campaign. We lived, it seemed, in 2 entirely different worlds. On 19th February, a further conference took place, and this time Field Marshal versus Kleist had been asked to attend. Apparently, Hitler's stay at my headquarters had quite impressed him after all as to the dangers on the German southern wing, for he announced that Army Group A was henceforth to transfer whatever forces it could possibly spare to Southern Army Group. In his own words, Army Group A would henceforth be regarded as an adjacent reservoir of forces for the Southern Army Group front, which presumably meant that his plan for bringing the Kuban bridgehead back into the operational picture at some later date was now on the shelf. The future was to show, unfortunately, that this reservoir was not to be exploited on anything like the scale which the transport facilities over the Crimea would have allowed. The Kuban bridgehead was to go on living its isolated existence. Experience has long taught that nothing is more difficult than to get forces released from a place once they have been wrongly tied up there. That day tension mounted even higher when the enemy, apparently in considerable strength, reached the railway station of Cincinokovo. As a result of this, he not only temporarily blocked the main supply line to the centre and right wing of the Army Group, but was also less than 40 miles away from the headquarters in which the Führer of the Reich was staying. As there were no troops whatever on the intervening ground, I was most relieved when Hitler flew home the same afternoon. It was quite conceivable that by the following day the enemy tanks could have denied us the use of our airfield lying east of the Dnieper. The last point I had made to Hitler was that I should need almost all the armoured divisions for the blows I intended delivering on the western wing, which meant they would have to be taken away from the Mius positions. If it had been possible to hold the latter until now, The only reason was that the main body of the enemy forces advancing on them had to pass through the Rostov bottleneck and had not yet arrived. The possibility that the Donetsk area would be taken from the east, therefore, was one which could not be ignored. Nothing could be done to prevent it until we had first removed the danger of the army groups being cut off from its rear communications. This Hitler seemed to grasp. In any case, I had the impression that Hitler's visit to my headquarters had helped to bring home to him the danger of encirclement, which immediately threatened the southern wing of the Eastern Front, and would continue to do so for some time to come. In spite of this, a story was soon afterwards circulated by OKW or General Schmundt that the real purpose of Hitler's trip had been to put some backbone into the army group. I am not aware that my headquarters was ever in need of this. Even if we were not prepared to do what Hitler demanded and fight stolidly for every foot of ground regardless of the consequences of holding on at all costs, I do not think it would be easy to find another headquarters which, in the teeth of so many crises, clung more stubbornly than our own to its will for victory. In this respect, there was never the slightest divergence between my staff and myself. On 19th of February, the Army Group ordered 4th Panzer Army to deploy for its counterattack against the enemy, who had come over the line Pereshchepino-Pavlograd-Grishino to cut off the Army Group from the Dnieper. On 20th of February, the picture of the enemy's operational intentions became completely clear and proved to be exactly as we had anticipated. On our eastern front, the enemy attacked Army Detachment Hollitz's positions on the Mius, breaking through at 3 main points. To cut our communications over the Dnieper, he appeared to have committed, in addition to the forces held up by us at Grishino and Kramatorskaya, an army with a strength of 3 rifle divisions, 2 tank corps and some cavalry. Simultaneously, he was trying to break through the weak front of Army Detachment Kempf, General Lantz having now been relieved by General Kempf, to the west and southwest of Kharkov. Furthermore, he was making a bid to envelop this army detachment on its northwestern wing and, by reaching further north, to outflank it completely. In the face of these developments, the army group had 2 different things to accomplish. It must try to hold the eastern front on the Mius to the best of its ability, though whether it could do so with such limited forces and without any reserves was an open question. Secondly, it must use 4th Panzer Army to bring about the quick defeat of the enemy in between 1st Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf in order to prevent its own isolation from the Dnieper crossings. If it failed in this, most of the army group's forces would shortly be immobilized through a lack of motor fuel. Once it had been possible to beat the enemy force between the Donetsk and Dnieper, it would depend on how the situation had developed in the meantime, whether we could immediately thrust northwards with all our mobile forces in order to restore the position of Army Detachment Kempf. On the other hand, it might first be necessary for 4th Panzer Army to fight another action in the area of 1st Panzer Army if the latter had still not succeeded in dealing on its own with the enemy at Grishino and Kramatorskaya. In any case, we must hold off on our northern wing, i.e. in Army Detachment Kempf's area, for the time being. All that the latter could be given to do at present was to bar the way to the Dnieper, be it through Krasnograd to Dnepropetrovsk or through Poltava to Kremenchug, by putting up the toughest possible resistance. Should the enemy by any chance be aspiring to reach Kiev, and the many signs that he were making Hitler increasingly apprehensive, we could only wish him a pleasant trip. Such a far-flung outflanking movement was hardly likely to achieve any positive results before the muddy season set in. 21st February brought us the first hints of relief on what at present were the army group's most vital stretches of front. The eastern front on the Mius had held. The remnants of the enemy cavalry corps, long surrounded behind it at Debaltsevo, were finally compelled to surrender. An enemy tank corps, which had been encircled after breaking through the Mius front at Matveyev-Kurgan, was also doomed to destruction. On the right wing of 1st Panzer Army, the enemy was maintaining his pressure on the Freta-Pico group, obviously with the object of next unhinging the Mius position or outflanking the northern front of 1st Panzer Army. Opposite the latter, everything remained quiet. Monitored wireless messages made it clear that the Soviet force engaged on the western front of 1st Panzer Army at Grishino and in the Kramatorskaya area, i.e. the Popov Group, was faring badly. Evidently its supplies had broken down. 4th Panzer Army had taken Pavlograd, and there was reason to hope that its last formations would have closed up with the main body before the roads softened. The fact that a not very powerful enemy tank force had thrust close up to Zaporozhye did not now imply any great danger. It ran out of petrol some 12 miles from the town and was duly destroyed piecemeal. Unfortunately, a new division destined for Pavlograd, 332, was diverted to the right wing of Central Army Group by OKH, while already on its way up to us. Though Second Army's position was probably not at all rosy, Southern Army Group had a prior claim now that we were finally on the way to regaining the initiative. Whether the enemy made any progress towards Kiev in the meantime was comparatively unimportant. That the enemy did harbour such intentions was shown by the fact that Soviet forces were advancing in considerable strength from the Belgorod direction towards Aktyrka, clearly with a view to getting round the northern flank of Army Detachment Kempf. In the next few days, 4th Panzer Army's counterstroke achieved the success for which we had been hoping. With that, the initiative in this campaign at last passed back to the German side. For a start, the army smashed the forces advancing towards the Dnieper crossings, i.e. those in the area around and south of Pavlograd. What Hitler had refused to accept was now substantiated in that there did prove to be 2 tank, 1 rifle and 1 cavalry corps involved. Immediately afterwards it was possible, in cooperation with 1st Panzer Army, to defeat the 4 enemy tank and mechanized corps opposite its western front. By 1st March it was clear that by reason of his defeats between the Donets and Dnieper, the enemy was also beginning to soften up opposite the northern front of 1st Panzer Army, and that the latter would regain the Donets line in this sector. One felt a strong temptation to chase the enemy across the still frozen river and take him in the rear in and west of Kharkov. To have our hands free to advance across the middle Donets, however, it was first necessary to knock out the southern wing of the enemy's Kharkov group, which was present in force on the Berestovaya, southwest of the city. Whether this could still be done in view of the imminent thaw was more than doubtful. Consequently, the army group had to content itself initially with seeking out and defeating the Kharkov enemy west of the Donets. In the southern strip of the army group's operational area, near to the coast, it had already started to thaw. At the end of February, the enemy on the Mius front had given up his attempt to break through with armoured and other mobile formations, and sent in rifle divisions instead. Evidently, he wanted to have at least some bridgeheads west of the river before the mud came. After even this broad assault had failed, his offensive finally degenerated into fruitless local attacks. By 2nd March, the army group was able to survey the results of its first counterblow, delivered by 4th Panzer Army and the left wing of 1st Panzer Army against the enemy between the Donets and Dnieper. In the course of this attack and Army Detachment Holit's successful defensive on the Mius, the armies of the enemy's southwest front had received such a beating that they were temporarily incapable of further offensive action. Particularly heavy punishment had been meted out to the forces which had driven forward against the left wing of 1st Panzer Army and into the gap between the latter and Army Detachment Kempf, the Soviet 6th Army, the Popov Group, which had fought at Grishino, and 1st Guards Army. The enemy's 25 Tank Corps and 3 Rifle Divisions could be written off completely, while 3 and 10 Tank Corps and 4 Guards Tank Corps, 1 Independent Armoured Brigade, 1 Mechanized Brigade, 1 Rifle Division, and 1 Ski Brigade were known to have had a severe battering. In addition, heavy losses had been suffered by 1 Guards Tank Corps and 18 Tank Corps, as well as by 6 rifle divisions and 2 ski brigades. According to reports received from our own troops, the enemy had left some 23,000 dead on the Donets-Dnieper battlefield, and the booty included 615 tanks, 354 field pieces, 69 anti-aircraft guns, and large numbers of machine guns and mortars. The figure of 9,000 prisoners appeared small in comparison. The reason for it was that our own forces, most of which were armoured, had not been able to form an unbroken ring round the enemy. Because of the cold, particularly at night, the troops tended to bunch together in and around the villages, with the result that individual Soviet soldiers and units which abandoned their vehicles were left with plenty of room to slip away over the intervening countryside. It had not been possible to block the Donets in the enemy's rear, as it was still icebound and entirely passable to lightly armed troops moving on foot. Apart from the enemy losses already mentioned, 4 Guards mechanized corps, which had been encircled behind the Mius front, and 7 Guards cavalry corps were also wiped out. After thus regaining the initiative by the victory between the Donets and Dnieper, Southern Army Group proceeded to deliver the stroke against the Voronezh front, i.e. the enemy forces located in the Kharkov area, in accordance with an order already issued on 28th of February. The intention was to attack these forces on their southern flank, with the aim either of turning the latter or, if at all possible, of later driving into the enemy rear from the east. Our object was not the possession of Kharkov, but the defeat, and if possible the destruction, of the enemy units located there. Hence the first priority was to smash the enemy's southern wing, which consisted of 3rd Soviet Tank Army on the Berestovaya southwest of the city. This was achieved by 4th Panzer Army by 5th March. Of 3rd Tank Army, 12 and 4 Tank Corps, a cavalry corps and 3 rifle divisions were partly cut to pieces and partly captured in a small pocket at Krasnograd. While there were once again relatively few prisoners, our own troops put the number of enemy dead at 12,000 and reported the capture of 61 tanks, 225 guns, and 600 motor vehicles. A turn in the weather prevented the army group from now moving against the rear of the enemy, harassing Army Detachment Kempf at Akhturka and Poltava, in order to make him fight a battle with reversed front. This would have necessitated 4th Panzer armies crossing the Donets downstream from Kharkov, but the ice was liable to break up at any time, and no pontoon bridges would have held against the drift ice. Even to launch a smaller-scale flanking movement by crossing the Mosh and taking the city, through which the enemy's rear communications ran, from behind hardly seemed feasible now that the ground was thawing out. Thus, an attempt had to be made to roll up the enemy from the flank and to force him away from Kharkov in the process. With this aim in view, 4th Panzer Army, including the SS Panzer Corps, the last formation of which, the Death's Head Division, had meanwhile arrived complete, attacked in a northward direction from the Krasnograd area on 7th of March. Army Detachment Kempf joined in as soon as the enemy began to relax his pressure on its own front. The attack made good progress in the days that followed. By this time, however, the enemy had recognized the threat to his Voronezh front. Our radio monitors ascertained that he was moving what appeared to be several tank and mechanized corps from the Voroshilovgrad area to Isium, presumably for use against the flank of 4th Panzer Army as it drove north of Kharkov. These, however, no longer achieved any notable impression, either because they had expended their offensive capacity in the preceding battles around Voroshilovgrad or on the Mius, or else because the thawing of the Donets hindered their intervention. All the enemy could do was to win a minor bridgehead northwest of Isium on the south bank of the river. He also fetched 2 Guards Tank Corps up to Kharkov from the east and pulled certain of his forces which had been harassing Army Detachment Kempf's northern wing and 2nd Army back to Bogodukov. As 2nd Army was too weak to go over to the offensive itself, it seemed doubtful whether we should succeed in preventing the forces which had pushed a long way west towards and north of Akhturka from escaping eastwards. Whatever happened, though, we wanted to try to force the enemy facing Army Detachment Kempf further south away from Kharkov, or alternatively to cut him off from the Donets crossings east of the river. If this came off, Kharkov could be taken by a coup de main. At all costs, the army group wished to avoid Kharkov's becoming a second Stalingrad, in which our assault forces might become irretrievably committed. It was inevitable, however, that the name of Kharkov should act as a magic stimulus on the fighting troops and less senior command staffs. The SS Panzer Corps, wishing to lay the recaptured city at its Führer's feet as a symbol of victory, was eager to take the shortest route there, so that the army group had to intervene vigorously on more than one occasion to ensure that the corps did not launch a frontal assault on Kharkov and become tied down there while enemy elements still fighting to the west of the city were able to make good their escape. In the end, it was possible to bring the SS Panzer Corps round to the east. The city fell without difficulty, and we succeeded in cutting off the retreat of considerable numbers of the enemy across the Donets. As has been seen, the enemy had been compelled by developments in the area around and south of Kharkov to thin out his forces opposite Army Detachment Kempf when they were already near to Poltava and in possession of Akhturka further north. Subsequently, he had to move them back towards Kharkov and Belgorod, with Army Detachment Kempf in close pursuit. On 10th March, Hitler paid our headquarters a further visit. In addition to briefing him on the current situation, I dealt in particular with our view of how operations should be conducted at the end of the muddy season, which was now setting in. This will be covered in the next chapter. On 14th March, Kharkov fell to the SS Panzer Corps. At the same time, on the northern wing of Army Detachment Kempf, the Grossdeutschland Division moved swiftly on Belgorod. The enemy once again threw in strong armoured forces to oppose it, but these were wiped out at Gavaron. The capture of Kharkov and Belgorod marked the conclusion of Army Group's second counterblow, as the increasing muddiness of the ground did not permit any further operations. As a matter of fact, the Army Group would have liked to wind up by clearing out, with the help of Central Army Group, the enemy salient extending some distance westwards of Kursk in order to shorten the German front. The scheme had to be abandoned, however, as Central Army Group declared itself unable to cooperate. As a result, the salient continued to constitute a troublesome dent in our front, which left certain openings to the enemy, and at the same time cramped our own operations. Nevertheless, the Army Group was now securely in possession of the entire Donets front from Belgorod, down to where the Mius positions branched off from it. These Donets and Mius fronts together formed the very same line as had been held by German troops in the winter of 1941-2. If, in conclusion, we cast a final glance at the full course and outcome of the 1942-3 winter campaign in South Russia, we must begin by acknowledging the successes attained on the Soviet side, the magnitude of which was incontestable. The Russians had contrived to encircle and destroy the German Sixth Army, the strongest we had in the field. They had, moreover, swept 4 Allied armies clean off the map. Many brave members of the latter had fallen in battle, and considerable numbers had gone into captivity. What Allied troops remained had disintegrated, and had sooner or later to be withdrawn for good from the zone of operations. Even though it was possible to reconstitute the majority of Sixth Army's divisions from residual units and replacements, and for Army Detachment Hollet to assume the designation of Sixth Army in March 1943, the loss of the bulk of the fighting troops of 20 divisions, besides a considerable proportion of the Army artillery and engineers, was quite irreparable. And limited though the fighting efficiency of the Allied armies might be, their loss was still a considerable one, depriving us as it did of a substitute for German forces on quiet sectors of the front. Yet despite the disappearance of 5 whole armies from the German order of battle, no one can say that this alone need have decisively influenced the outcome of the war. It was accompanied by the loss of the whole of the immense territories we had won in the 1942 summer offensive, together with their natural resources. The grab for the Caucasian oil fields, one of the fundamental aims of that offensive, had failed to come off. And here we may note that this economic goal, on which Göring had been so insistent, decisively contributed to the offensive's split. In their pursuit of this economic objective, people had forgotten that its attainment and retention always depended on defeating the main body of the enemy forces. All the same, it had still been possible to hold the part of the Donets Basin that was essential to the conduct of the war. But great though their gains undoubtedly were, the Russians had still not succeeded in winning their decisive victory over the German southern wing, the destruction of which could probably never have been made good by our side. By the end of the winter campaign, the initiative was back in German hands, and the Russians had suffered 2 defeats. Though not decisive in character, these did lead to a stabilization of the front and offer the German command a prospect of fighting the war in the east to a draw. Nevertheless, we could clearly bury any hope of changing the course of the war by an offensive in the summer of 1943. Our loss of fighting power had already been far too great for anything of that order. The obvious inference for the Supreme Command to draw was that it must strive with every means at its disposal to come to terms with at least one of Germany's opponents. Similarly, it must realize the need to base its subsequent conduct of the war in the East on a policy of sparing its own forces, particularly by avoiding the loss of entire armies, as at Stalingrad, while seeking to wear down the offensive capacity of the enemies. To that end, resolutely ignoring all secondary aspirations, it must switch the main effort to the Eastern theatre for as long as Germany's Western adversaries were unable to land in France or to deliver a critical blow from the Mediterranean area. If we now return to the 1942-3 winter offensive and its outcome, the next question to ask is why the Soviet command, despite its big successes in this campaign, did not achieve the decisive success of annihilating the whole of the German southern wing. After all, with that overwhelming number of formations and the operational advantages it possessed at the outset, it had the highest possible trumps to play. It must be emphasized for a start that the Soviet command showed no lack of aggressive spirit and engaged its troops without the least regard for casualties in order to attain its objectives. The troops themselves, as was almost invariably true of the Russians, fought with great bravery and at times made unbelievable sacrifices. Nonetheless, there was an unmistakable fall-off in the quality of the infantry, and the losses of artillery in 1941-2 had still not been made good. Since the beginning of the war, the Soviet leaders had unquestionably learnt a great number of lessons, especially regarding the organization and use of large armoured formations. Although the enemy had possessed large numbers of tanks as early as 1941, he had not known then how to use them as individual members of a united whole. By now he had them properly organized in his tank and mechanized corps, and had also taken over the German technique of penetration in depth. In spite of this, we almost always succeeded, except in the situation of November 1942, in ultimately beating or destroying these tank and mechanized formations, even when they had already driven deep into the German forward areas. After the encirclement of Sixth Army, on the other hand, they were never again able to drive through to vital spots with such speed and in such strength as to fulfill the aim of cutting off the German southern wing, whether on the Don, the coast of the Sea of Azov, or the lower Dnieper. Except for Stalingrad, where Hitler gave it the opportunity, the Soviet command was never able to bring about a battle of encirclement, as we had done on various occasions in 1941, taking several thousand prisoners in the process. This held good in spite of the Russians' enormous preponderance of forces in the winter of 1942-3, and the fact that the opening situation and the collapse of the Allied armies afforded them a free passage into the rear of the German front. We, on the other hand, had had to fight a mainly frontal battle in 1941. So let us take a look at the Soviet leadership at the top. In view of the operational situation that existed at the end of the German summer offensive, the strategic aim of encircling the German southern wing was so palpably evident that it could not possibly be overlooked. The idea of breaking through the fronts of the Allied armies was also a very obvious move. In other words, not very much genius was required on the Soviet side to draft an operations plan in the late autumn of 1942. The first stroke, the encirclement of Sixth Army, was undoubtedly correct. If it succeeded, and the German Supreme Command did everything to see that it did, the strongest striking force the Germans had would be eliminated. It would have been better if this first blow had been coordinated with the offensive against the fronts of the Italian and Hungarian armies, in order that every effort should be made from the start to cut off the German forces at Rostov or on the Sea of Azov in one unified and large-scale assault operation. Clearly, the available artillery was not equal to the task, and for this reason, presumably, the breakthrough operations had to be staggered. It is also conceivable that the transport situation did not allow the sum total of assault forces to be assembled and supplied simultaneously. However, the unexpectedly swift and complete collapse of the Allied armies on our own side compensated the Soviets to a great extent for the inconveniences which this staggering of the three breakthrough offensives entailed. When the Soviet command failed to accomplish its mission of tying off the German southern wing on the lower Don, the Sea of Azov, or in the last instance the Dnieper, the reason was certainly not that its offensive was necessarily bound to get bogged down in that extensive zone of operations. When considered by the standards of modern warfare, the distances to be covered by the Soviet assault groups to their various objectives were by no means excessive, nor were the German reserves which were thrown in to meet them so strong that the Soviet offensive need have come to a standstill short of its decisive objectives and have ultimately ended in a serious reverse. On the contrary, one must say that, with the exception of Stalingrad, the Soviet command never managed to coordinate strength and speed when hitting a decisive spot. In the first phase of the winter campaign, it undoubtedly tied down unnecessarily large forces against Sixth Army in order to make doubly sure of its prize. In doing so, it let slip the chance to cut off the German southern wing's supply lines on the lower Don. The forces that attacked the Cheer front were certainly strong, but they did not act in concert. After the breakthrough on the Italian front, the Soviet command similarly failed to stake everything on quickly crossing the Donets and reaching Rostov. With such far-reaching objectives involved, there was admittedly a danger that the Russians would later be attacked in the flank themselves, but they should have expected to derive the necessary protection here from the offensive due to be launched on the Hungarian front immediately afterwards. Risky, I agree, but anyone who is not prepared to take such risks will never achieve decisive and, as was essential in this case, speedy results. Even after the successful breakthrough against the Hungarian army, which tore open the German front from the Donets to Voronezh, the Soviet command still failed to press on with sufficient speed and strength in the decisive direction towards the Dnieper crossings. Instead of putting all its eggs in one basket and simply leaving a strong, concentrated shock group to provide offensive protection to the west, it squandered its forces in a series of far-ranging uncoordinated thrusts at Akhterka and Poltava by way of Kursk, against the Dnieper, and across the Donets line Slavyansk, Lysychensk, Voroshilovgrad. In this way it enabled the German command to be stronger at the decisive spots when the time came. Schlieffen once said that both sides in a battle or campaign, the loser just as much as the winner, contribute to the outcome by the various actions they take. The German Supreme Command's share of responsibility for the loss of Sixth Army, and indeed for the whole crisis which arose on the southern wing of the Eastern Front in the winter of 1942-3, has already been plainly stated. It is thus only fair to mention what contribution the German side made to the Russians' ultimate failure to encircle the German southern wing. In this respect, only one thing need be said. But for the almost superhuman achievements of the German troops and their commanders in facing up to an enemy many times their superior in numbers, the army group could never have succeeded in bringing its defeat underfoot. This winter campaign could never have been fought had not our brave infantry divisions, unlike the troops of our allies, and often without adequate anti-tank defences, stood firm before the assaults of the enemy's armoured formations, and, by closing the front behind his tanks whenever they broke through, ensured their ultimate destruction. A similar debt was owed to our Panzer divisions, which fought with unparalleled versatility and more than doubled their effectiveness by the way they dodged from one place to the next. The German fighting troops, convinced of their superiority as soldiers, stood their ground in the most desperate situations, and their courage and self-sacrifice did much to compensate for the enemy's numerical preponderance. One thing must not be forgotten. It was the valiant Sixth Army which, by loyally fighting on to the last, snatched the palm of an annihilating victory against the German southern wing from the enemy's hand. Had it, instead of resisting till early February, given up the struggle as soon as its position became hopeless, the Russians could have thrown in such an extra weight of forces at the crucial spots that their aim to encircle the whole southern wing of the German front would most probably have been achieved. Such was Sixth Army's vital contribution to our success in once more stabilising the situation on the Eastern Front in March 1943. Though the self-sacrifice of the men of Sixth Army may have been in vain so far as the final outcome of the war was concerned, this can never annul its moral worth. That is why, now that we have come to the end of the chapter, the name of Sixth Army is to shine forth for one last time. This army fulfilled the highest demand that can ever be made on a soldier, to fight on to the last in a hopeless situation for the sake of his comrades. The preceding chapter has shown that the winter campaign of 1942-3, which had start CD with the Russian breakthrough on the Don and Volga on both sides of Stalingrad, did not ultimately bring the Soviet command the decisive operational success for which it might have hoped. The question now was how the German side should continue the struggle the following summer. Obviously, after so many major formations had been lost, there would no longer be the forces available to mount another crucial offensive on the scale of 1941 and 1942. What did still seem possible, given proper leadership on the German side, was that the Soviet Union could be worn down to such an extent that it would tire of its already excessive sacrifices and be ready to accept a stalemate. At the time in question, this was far from being wishful thinking. On the other hand, such an aim could not be realized by going over to purely defensive, static warfare. For one thing, there were not enough German divisions to defend the far-flung front from the Baltic to the Black Sea decisively. For another, it was unlikely that the Soviets would take any action until the Western Allies landed in Europe, the danger of which had become all the more acute in the light of recent events in North Africa. The German command thus had very little time left in which to force a draw in the east. It could only do so if it succeeded within the framework of a, now inevitable, strategic defensive, in dealing the enemy powerful blows of a localized character which would sap his strength to a decisive degree, first and foremost through losses in prisoners. This presupposed an operational elasticity on our part, which would give maximum effect to the still superior quality of the German command staffs and fighting troops. We naturally had to consider what action the Soviet command would take once the muddy season was over. Would Stalin wait until his allies had met his repeated demands for a landing on the European mainland? Though it seemed very natural that he should do so, there were still many arguments against it. Soviet self-confidence had undoubtedly increased since the big successes late in the previous autumn. Could the Soviet leaders possibly afford, from a psychological point of view, to call a halt to their loudly advertised liberation of the holy soil of Russia? Must the Kremlin not be anxious to beat its allies to the Balkans, the traditional target of Russian expansionism? Assuming that the enemy resumed the offensive as soon as he had made good his losses, therefore, it seemed certain that he would continue to direct the main pressure of his attacks against the southern wing of the German front, i.e. against Southern Army Group. The bulge in the German front, which ran down the Donets and Meuse from a point below Kharkov, embracing the valuable coal mining and industrial regions south of that city, was just begging to be sliced off. Should the enemy succeed in breaking through around Kharkov, or even across the middle Donets, he could still achieve his aim of the previous winter and destroy the German southern wing on the Black Sea coast. At this time, Army Group A was still in the Kuban bridgehead. By the same stroke, he would regain possession of the precious Donets area and the granaries of Ukraine, in addition to opening the way to the Balkans and Romanian oil fields, with all the political consequences this would have entailed in regard to Turkey. In no other sector of the Eastern Front was the Soviet Union offered such immense opportunities in the military, economic or political fields. The decisive thrust, then, would be delivered against Southern Army Group, a fact which, in view of the Russians' numerical superiority, naturally did not exclude the possibility of smaller-scale offensives in other parts of the front. Southern Army Group had on a number of occasions brought these considerations to the notice of OKH and Hitler. What the latter ultimately had to decide was whether the overall situation allowed us to wait for the Russians to start an offensive and then to hit them hard on the backhand at the first good opportunity, or whether we should attack as early as possible ourselves and, still within the framework of a strategic defensive, strike a limited blow on the forehand. The Army Group preferred the former solution as one offering better prospects operationally, and had already submitted a tentative plan to Hitler in February. It envisaged that if the Russians did as we anticipated and launched a pincer attack on the Donetsk area from the north and south, an operation which could sooner or later be supplemented by an offensive around Kharkov, our arc of front along the Donetsk and Mius should be given up in accordance with an agreed timetable to draw the enemy westwards towards the lower Dnieper. Simultaneously, all the reserves that could possibly be released, in particular the bulk of the armour, were to assemble in the area west of Kharkov, first to smash the enemy assault forces, which we expected to find there, and then to drive into the flank of those advancing in the direction of the lower Dnieper. In this way, the enemy would be doomed to suffer the same fate on the coast of the Sea of Azov as he had in store for us on the Black Sea. The plan did not meet with Hitler's approval, however. He was still preoccupied with the economic aspects of the Donetsk basin and apprehensive about the possible repercussions of an even temporary evacuation on the attitudes of Turkey and Romania. But what probably did most to prejudice him was his belief that we must fight for every foot of the ground he had won from Stalin in the winter of 1941, and which had, in his view, saved the German army from a Napoleonic retreat. Besides this, however, he undoubtedly shrank from the risks which the proposed operation would assuredly entail. Inwardly, perhaps, he did not trust himself to cope with them, for in spite of having a certain eye for tactics, he still lacked the ability of a great captain. Consequently, our minds now turned to the idea of a forehand stroke. An attempt must be made to strike the enemy a blow of limited scope before he could recover from his losses in the winter campaign and resuscitate his beaten forces. A suitable target was presented by the Soviet salient, which protruded far into our own front line around the city of Kursk. The Russians, facing the boundary between Central and Southern Army groups, had been able to retain this when the muddy season set in, and it now formed a jumping-off position for any attacks they might be contemplating against the flanks of the two German army groups. The appreciable Soviet forces inside the salient would be cut off if our attack were successful, and provided that we launched it early enough, we could hope to catch them in a state of unpreparedness. In particular, the enemy would have to commit the armoured units which had been so severely battered towards the end of the winter campaign, thereby giving us a chance to punish them wholesale. And so we come to Operation Citadel, the last major offensive operation undertaken by the Germans in the east. For this attack against the Kursk Bulge, Southern Army Group provided two armies, 4th Panzer and Detachment Kempf, comprising 11 armoured or Panzer Grenadier divisions and 5 infantry. In order to do so, of course, it had to thin out the Donetsk and Mius fronts considerably. For the attack from the north, Central Army Group provided 9th Army, consisting of 6 armoured or Panzer Grenadier divisions and 5 infantry. The principal danger here lay in the armies having to assemble in the salient jutting out to the east around Orel, where the enemy might attack it in the rear from the east and north. Operation Citadel was timed to start in the first half of May, when the ground could be expected to have dried out sufficiently, and the enemy would still not have finished refitting, especially his armour. At the beginning of May, however, Hitler decided, against the advice of the two army group commanders, to postpone Citadel till June, by which time he hoped our armoured divisions would be stronger still after being fitted out with new tanks. He stuck to his decision even after it had been pointed out to him that the unfavourable developments in Tunisia could mean that if Citadel were put off any longer, there would be a danger of its coinciding with an enemy landing on the continent. Nor would he recognise that the longer one waited, the more armour the Russians would have, particularly as their tank output undoubtedly exceeded that of Germany. As a result of delays in the delivery of our own new tanks, the Army Group was not ultimately able to move off on Citadel until the beginning of July, by which time the essential advantage of a forehand blow was lost. The whole idea had been to attack before the enemy had replenished his forces and got over the reverses of the winter. At the same time, it was certain that the longer we took to launch the operation, the greater must be the threat to those of Southern Army Group's armies in the Donetsk-Mius salient, which had to hand over all their available forces, and most of all, to the Oral Bulge as the jumping-off base of Central Army Group's 9th Army. On 5th July, the German armies were finally able to attack. Though every deception and camouflage measure had been taken, we could no longer expect to catch the enemy unawares after a delay of that length. On the assault front of Central Army Group, 9th Army succeeded in penetrating the enemy fortifications to a depth of about 9 miles in the first 2 days. After heavy fighting in which it had to beat off counterattacks by enemy reserves, it managed to deepen this penetration by a few more miles up till 9th July, but then it came to a halt before a built-in system of positions on a dominant height to the rear of the front. Its intention of resuming the attack in a few days' time was frustrated by the enemy, who attacked the Oral Bulge in strength from the north and northeast on 11th of July. To support 2nd Panzer Army in holding this front, the Army Group found itself compelled to throw strong mobile forces from 9th Army into the Oral battle. The offensive in Southern Army Group's area developed more favourably. Here, too, the attack through the enemy's deeply echeloned defences proved difficult enough and made only slow progress. However, by 10th July it had been possible to break through the last position into the area of Prokhorovka and Oboyan. During this time, hasty counterattacks by the enemy's mobile reserves were beaten off, in the course of which 10 tank or mechanised corps were either smashed or severely battered. By 13th of July, the enemy facing Southern Army Group had lost 24,000 men as prisoners, 1 to 800 tanks, 267 field pieces, and 1,080 anti-tank guns. On 13th of July, when the battle was at its climax and the issue apparently at hand, the commanders of the 2 army groups concerned were summoned to Hitler. He opened the conference by announcing that the Western Allies had landed in Sicily that day and that the situation there had taken an extremely serious turn. The Italians were not even attempting to fight, and the island was likely to be lost. Since the next step might well be a landing in the Balkans or Lower Italy, it was necessary to form new armies in Italy and the Western Balkans. These forces must be found from the Eastern Front, so Citadel would have to be discontinued. Thus the very thing had come to pass of which I had warned Hitler in May. The commander of Central Army Group, Field Marshal Verser Klug, reported that 9th Army was making no further headway and that he was having to deprive it of all its mobile forces to check the enemy's deep incursions into the Oral salient. There could be no question of continuing with Citadel or of resuming the operation at a later date. Speaking for my own army group, I pointed out that the battle was now at its culminating point, and that to break it off at this moment would be tantamount to throwing a victory away. On no account should we let go of the enemy until the mobile reserves he had committed were completely beaten. Nonetheless, Hitler ruled that Citadel was to be called off on account of the situation in the Mediterranean and the state of affairs in Central Army Group. The only concession he would make was that Southern Army Group should continue the attack until it had achieved its aim of smashing the enemy's armoured reserves. As a matter of fact, not even this could be accomplished, for only a few days later the Army Group was ordered to hand over several armoured divisions to Central Army Group. The assault groups of both formations had to be withdrawn to their original start lines, and so the last German offensive in the east ended in a fiasco, even though the enemy opposite the 2 attacking armies of Southern Army Group had suffered 4 times their losses in prisoners, dead and wounded. When Citadel was called off, the initiative in the eastern theatre of war finally passed to the Russians. Now that we had failed to encircle strong forces of the enemy in the Kursk salient, and had even had to cut short the action against his mobile reserves before anything decisive could be achieved, his preponderance of numbers was bound to make itself felt. Indeed, his attack on the Oral Bulge was only the prelude to a grand offensive. Henceforth, Southern Army Group found itself waging a defensive struggle, which could not be anything more than a system of improvisations and stopgaps. Being too weak on that widely extended front for purely passive defence against an enemy so many times stronger than itself, it had to concentrate its efforts. Even at the risk of repercussions in sectors temporarily less threatened, on punctually assembling forces wherever there was a Soviet breakthrough to intercept or a chance of inflicting a blow on the enemy. What had to be avoided at all costs was that any elements of the Army Group should become cut off through deep enemy breakthroughs and suffer the same fate as 6th Army at Stalingrad. To maintain ourselves in the field, and in doing so to wear down the enemy's offensive capacity to the utmost, became the whole essence of this struggle. As had been expected, the enemy's first blow was directed against the front embracing the Donetsk area. On 17th July, a powerful offensive was launched against 6th Army on the Myos and 1st Panzer Army on the Middle Donetsk. While achieving considerable penetration, however, the enemy was unable to force a breakthrough. 6th Army, by committing both the mechanized formations left as reserves in the Donetsk area, was able to halt the attack after the enemy had won a bridgehead 12 miles wide and 10 miles deep on the west bank of the Mius north of Kuybyshev. In the case of 1st Panzer Army, the enemy succeeded in crossing the Donetsk southeast of Isium on roughly a 20-mile front, but by throwing in both the divisions of 24 Panzer Corps moving up from Kharkov, it was possible to prevent him from gaining any further ground south of the river. Even though we were able to halt these Soviet attacks by the end of July, however, the situation in the Donetsk area was still hardly tenable from a long-term point of view, and so, having itself had to call off the Citadel operation for good on 17th of July on orders from Hitler, Southern Army Group decided to withdraw a substantial weight of armour from that wing for the time being in order to iron things out in the Donetsk area. We hoped to have given the enemy so much punishment in the course of Citadel that we could now count on a breathing space in this part of the front. Without a doubt, this decision was a disastrous one in regard to subsequent events on the Army Group's northern wing, as the enemy took the offensive there earlier than we had expected. But mistaken though the move proved to be, the fact remains that it was conditioned by Hitler's insistence on holding the Donetsk area. In practice, moreover, the temporary weakening of the northern wing was limited to the withdrawal of HQ 3 Panzer Corps and 3 Panzer Division, since Hitler again put the SS Panzer Corps, now earmarked for Italy, at the Army Group's disposal for this one counterstroke in the Donetsk area. In view of the fact that the 2 Corps headquarters and 4 armoured divisions destined for the Donetsk area could only arrive one after the other, the Army Group proposed that the 2 leading divisions of the SS Corps should first deliver a short, sharp punch to straighten out 1st Panzer Army's position south of the Donetsk. Thereupon, the whole of our armour would be used to wipe out the big enemy bridgehead in 6th Army's sector and to restore the Mius front. Hitler, however, promptly banned any action in 1st Panzer Army's area, although there was not the least reason why this need have protracted the stay of the SS Corps. Since there had already been a case of interference in the Army Group's handling of operations during Citadel, i.e., when Hitler had stopped 24 Panzer Corps from being used with Army Detachment Kempf, I felt compelled to protest to OKH. This is what I wrote to General Zeitzler. If my misgivings about coming developments are disregarded, and if my intentions as a commander, which aim merely at removing difficulties for which I am not responsible, continue to be frustrated, I shall have no choice but to assume that the Führer has not the necessary confidence in this headquarters. I am far from believing myself infallible. Everyone makes mistakes, even great captains like Frederick and Napoleon. At the same time, I would point out that the 11th Army won the Crimean campaign under very difficult conditions, and that when faced with an almost hopeless situation at the end of last year, the Southern Army Group still mastered it. If the Führer thinks he can find any Army Group commander or headquarters staff with better nerves than we had during the past winter, with more initiative than we showed in the Crimea, on the Donets or at Kharkov, with greater powers of improvisation than were displayed by us in the Crimean or Winter Campaign, or with the ability to foresee the inevitable more clearly than we have done, I am fully prepared to hand over to them. As long as I remain at this post, however, I must have the chance to use my own head. July 30th saw the start of the counter-attack launched in the 6th Army's area by the armour brought over from the northern wing of the Army Group. It resulted in the complete restoration of the situation on the Mius front. The ratio of forces involved in this battle was indicative not only of the situation obtaining at the time, but also of the superior quality of the German troops. In his bridgehead, the enemy had no less than 16 rifle divisions, 2 mechanised corps, 1 armoured brigade, and 2 anti-tank brigades. The German counter-attack was performed by 4 armoured, 1 Panzer grenadier, and 2 infantry divisions. In the course of this counter-attack and the Soviet attacks preceding it, the enemy lost some 18,000 men as prisoners, 700 tanks, 200 field guns, and 400 anti-tank guns. Having thus succeeded in restoring the situation in the 6th Army's sector, we were still left with the festering wound on the 1st Panzer Army's Donets front. It could no longer be cauterized because of the storm now brewing over the Army Group's northern wing. From the moment when Army Detachment Kempf and 4th Panzer Army were withdrawn to their pre-citadel positions, the enemy had been putting them under steady pressure. Around the turn of the month, our radio monitoring and air reconnaissance showed him to be assembling a strong concentration of armour in the Kursk salient, obviously by bringing fresh forces over from the centre of the Eastern Front. Other offensive preparations were also noticed in the Donets Bend southeast of Kharkov. On August 2nd, we informed OKH that we were expecting an immediate offensive against the Army Group's northern front west of Belgorod. The Army Group had continually emphasised the decisive significance of its northern wing, where the enemy could be expected to launch another major attack in the near future. It would thus have been in line with our general conception of things to take steps to prevent any enemy success at this spot. To that end, we should have had to take 40 Panzer Corps out of the Dnieper Bend after its successful stroke at Krivoy Rog, and put it behind the northern wing of the Army Group, where arrangements would also have had to be made to commit the 3 extra armoured divisions still moving up. In view of the trend in 6th Army's area, however, this would inevitably have meant withdrawing 1st Panzer Army out of the eastern part of the Dnieper Bend, which would in turn have necessitated the abandonment of Nikopol and the evacuation of the Crimea. It is quite certain that Hitler, who had let the Army Group have all 5 armoured divisions for the express purpose of restoring the situation in the Dnieper Bend, would never have agreed to such a scheme of operations. He would have continued to insist that an attempt be made to hold the Dnieper Bend and the Crimea. This does not alter the fact that the Army Group still ought to have acted in the way indicated above. The proposal made by me, though justified in regard to the threat to 1st Panzer Army, was nevertheless a mistake as far as the Army Group's operations as a whole were concerned. As a result, 40 Panzer Corps was left pinned down in the Dnieper Bend. There were 2 reasons why I thus acted against my own basic conception of the way the operations should be conducted. One was the hope that while in possession of the Dnieper line on each side of Nikopol, we could deal the enemy surprise blows in quick succession on both banks of the river and, if successful, restore the position on the southern wing. The other reason was that if we did not venture this operation, we should have no choice but to give up the Crimea, a particularly painful prospect for those of us who had once conducted 11th Army's bitter struggle for the peninsula. It would still have been more correct, however, not to disregard the principle that the Army Group's northern wing was operationally the more important. At the beginning of November, the enemy again attacked the northern wing of the Army Group, 4th Panzer Army's Dnieper front, with strong forces. It was not clear whether this was an offensive with far-reaching aims, or whether the enemy first intended to win the necessary assembly space west of the river. It soon became evident that the formations of 4th Panzer Army would be unable to hold the Dnieper against the far stronger Russians, and by 5th of November it could be seen that Kiev would be lost. The army group concluded from this that it would now be necessary to fling all the forces that could be made available in its area, especially the 3 armoured divisions still on their way up, onto its northern wing. Since Hitler had released these divisions expressly for use in the lower Dnieper area, the agreement of OKH had to be obtained. If the latter could not supply 4th Panzer Army with further strong forces, there would be no alternative but to give up the Dnieper Bend. As no decision was forthcoming on this fundamental question, I flew to General Headquarters on 7th November. At the meeting, Hitler declared that he was not prepared to let slip this first unique opportunity offered by the Army Group's proposal to take a hand in 6th Army's area for the sake of preserving the Crimea. No success we might score at Kiev, he said, could be so effective that the armour up there would become free in time to help the southern wing. Neither the Crimea nor the defences on the lower Dnieper would hold out as long as that. To this I replied that by adhering to the plan for operations in the Dnieper Bend and 6th Army's area, we should be running far too great a risk on our northern wing, which would in turn affect the entire position of Southern Army Group and Army Group A. Much as I disliked forgoing the stroke south of the lower Dnieper, it was now absolutely essential that we intervene at Kiev with all 3 of the armoured divisions now arriving. Hitler retorted that there were both military and political reasons why we must achieve the success now offered to us in the area of the lower Dnieper. For one thing, the army must be made conscious that it was still capable of striking successful blows. For another, it was vitally necessary to our war economy that we retain the manganese deposits of Nikopol. Furthermore, the enemy must not be allowed to regain the Crimea as a basis for aerial warfare against the Romanian oil fields. While thoroughly appreciating Hitler's motives, I insisted that the risk on our northern wing was now becoming too great. If things went wrong with 4th Panzer Army, the fate of Southern Army Group and Army Group A would be sealed sooner or later. Hitler admitted the magnitude of the risk, but declared that it was one which must be accepted in our present situation and that he was prepared to shoulder the responsibility. I did succeed, nevertheless, in getting him to agree to send our northern wing the so often promised 4 Panzer Division of 2nd Army, incidentally it did not come this time either, the Nordland SS Brigade and, at a later date, 2 Parachute Division. In due course, moreover, he even reconciled himself to seeing not merely one of the 3 new armoured divisions, 25 Panzer, used with 4th Panzer Army instead of in the Dnieper Bend, but the 2 others as well, 1 Panzer and the Leibstandarte. On the other hand, the 2 armoured divisions of 40 Panzer Corps, 14 and 24, had to remain with 1st Panzer Army, where the door was still to be left open for a blow in 6th Army's area later on. In any case, they could not have been taken away as long as Hitler was not ready to withdraw 1st Panzer Army to the west from its perilous position in the Dnieper Bend, thereby renouncing Nikopol and the Crimea. In the next few days, the situation of 4th Panzer Army took a rapid turn for the worse. Its 11 infantry divisions, almost all of which were now down to regimental strength, were no longer a match for an opponent who had committed between 17 and 20 fully manned rifle divisions, 3 or 4 tank corps and 1 cavalry corps in the very first wave of his offensive. Even the 2 armoured divisions at the army's disposal as a mobile reserve were too weak to stop the enemy's breakthroughs. After heavy fighting, Kiev had to be evacuated in order that 7 corps should not be surrounded in the city. The latter was thrown back to the south, and could only halt the enemy advance some 30 miles away. On the western wing of 7 Corps, almost 40 miles southwest of Kiev, the railway junction of Fastov, so essential for detraining reinforcements and supplying 8th Army, fell to the Russians. Both corps on the Dnieper north of Kiev were thrown back to the west. 13 corps to Zhytomyr and 49 corps to Korostan. Each of these junctions, both of which were important for communication with Central Army Group and supplies to 4th Panzer Army, was reached by the enemy. 4th Panzer Army was now torn into 3 widely separated groups. The only ray of hope in this gloomy situation consisted in the fact that the enemy's assault was also split in two different directions, one south and the other west. The Soviet elements advancing westwards would be of no direct consequence as long as they were unable to swing south and perform a large-scale outflanking movement round the army group. To prevent them from doing so until the reinforcements brought up by the army group could intervene was the job of the two corps which had been pushed back to the west. Yet we were to pass through some critical days before the army group's countermeasures could take effect from mid-November onwards. These were to consist in a counterblow by the three fresh armoured divisions, 25-1 and the Leibstandarte under command of 48 Panzer Corps, which had been specially released for this purpose by the army group, against enemy armour advancing in a southwesterly direction from Kiev. At the moment, this was the most menacing enemy force in operation. Afterwards, the Panzer Corps was to wheel west and smash the enemy pursuing 13 Corps towards Zhytomyr. After a success in this quarter, it might yet be possible to drive into the rear of the enemy attacking southwards along the Dnieper. In order to reinforce 4th Panzer Army still further, the army group moved over two extra armoured divisions, 3 and 10, two Panzer Grenadier divisions, 20 and the SS Reich Division, and 198 Infantry Division from 8th Army. Admittedly, this unduly weakened 8th Army's front, but the army group had no choice but to thin out temporarily less important stretches of the front in favour of the decisive spot of the moment. Unfortunately, as 48 Panzer Corps could not be assembled before mid-November and the situation southwest of Kiev was becoming progressively more grave, the army group unexpectedly had to release the first available armoured division, 25 Panzer, for a limited attack at Fastov aimed at keeping the Panzer Corps' assembly area free. Once again, we saw what price a newly drafted division had to pay for its initiation into war conditions in the east. In addition, the divisional commander, who had hastened on in front with his reconnaissance battalion, was put out of action the moment it made contact with the enemy. Instead of leading to the recapture of the Fastov junction, therefore, this undertaking caused a psychological setback to troops who were fighting their first action in the east. Nonetheless, by actually making the attack and committing the forces brought over from 8th Army, it was possible to halt the enemy on the front south of Kiev and to prevent the Dnieper front from being outflanked any further. On 15th November, 48 Panzer Corps was able to deliver the projected counterblow. The first aim was reached with the defeat of the enemy tank corps advancing southwestwards from Kiev. Thereupon the pressure on 13th Corps was relieved by a swing to the west, and Zhytomyr was duly retaken. However, the Panzer Corps' ultimate thrust eastwards along the big Zhytomyr-Kiev road into the rear of the Soviet front south of Kiev came to grief in the mud. But even though this meant that the enemy could not be cleared from the western bank of the Dnieper, it had still been possible initially to overcome 4th Panzer Army's crisis by the beginning of December. The army now held a front running northwards from a point 25 miles south of Kiev to the area north of Zhytomyr. 49 Corps, still in its isolated position around Korostan, had been able to recapture the town and thereby to clear the railway link with Central Army Group. According to 4th Panzer Army, the enemy's losses in dead amounted to some 20,000 men. The fact that only 5,000 prisoners had been taken, as against the 600 tanks, 300 field guns, and over 1,200 anti-tank guns reported to have been either captured or destroyed, once again showed the steady rise in the Red Army's scale of equipment. Obviously, these returns were always open to duplication, but even when due allowance has been made for this, they still give a representative picture. Author. Of all the Soviet forces encountered on the Kiev front, 2/3 of the infantry divisions, as well as 4 tank, 1 mechanized, and 1 cavalry corps, could be regarded as seriously weakened. Unfortunately, the initially rapid retirement of 4th Panzer Army's corps to the south and west had given Hitler the idea that the command of the army must be placed in other hands. Although I insisted that the loss of the Dnieper front had been due to the superior strength of the enemy and the run-down state of our own divisions, rather than to errors in the leadership of the army, Hitler took the view that Colonel General Hoth needed a rest after the excessive strain of the last few years, and he was accordingly transferred to the reserve of officers. I deeply regretted his removal, but at least obtained an assurance that he would be given an army in the West after he had had some leave. Hoth was succeeded by a former Austrian officer, General Rauss, who had made his name in the army group as commander of 6 Panzer Division and later of 11 Corps. While the fighting was still in progress on 4th Panzer Army's front, the enemy had already recovered in mid-November from his setback at Krivoy Rog. With the help of fresh forces, he had launched another major attack in the Dnieper Bend against the northern front of 1st Panzer Army and the adjacent right wing, on a front facing east of 8th Army. On 1st Panzer Army's eastern front, he also tried to cross the river south of Zaporozhye and attacked 8th Army's Dnieper front on both sides of Cherkasy. Later, he extended his offensive still further by an attack from the south on the bridgehead of Nikopol. The corps of 6th Army in here had been placed under command of 1st Panzer Army. The enemy's obvious intention now was finally to encircle 1st Panzer Army in the east of the Dnieper Bend and to destroy it there. This turn of events in the second half of November impelled the army group to approach OKH regarding the further conduct of operations. A memorandum we submitted on 10th November was based on the premise that in spite of his present mass engagement of troops on the army group front, the enemy still had powerful strategic reserves at his disposal. According to available intelligence, we pointed out, 44 rifle divisions and a large number of armoured brigades set up by the Soviets in 1943 had still not been committed to battle. In addition, it could be assumed that 33 rifle divisions and 11 tank or mechanised corps were now being rested and refitted behind the enemy front. Hence, the enemy must be expected to go on with his offensive against the southern wing of the Eastern Front throughout the winter, exerting his main pressure on the northern wing of Southern Army Group. Even if our current counterstroke in 4th Panzer Army's sector should turn out favourably, the enemy would still be able to maintain an adequate assembly area west of the Dnieper from which to resume his offensive later on. For this reason, there could be no question of releasing forces from the army group's operationally decisive northern wing for a supporting action in the Dnieper Bend. Should it nevertheless be possible, we said, to ward off the enemy offensive now in full swing in the latter area and simultaneously to stabilise the situation in 4th Panzer Army's sector, things would still develop on the following lines. The army group would have to get through the winter holding a front which far exceeded the resources of its almost completely exhausted divisions. It would not have enough reserves to take effective action against any major enemy attacks, particularly if called upon to do so at several places at once. Operationally, therefore, the army group would remain completely at the enemy's mercy, a particularly dangerous state of affairs in view of the reduced fighting power of its own formations. No battle fought on this basis would have the effect of decisively diminishing the enemy's offensive capacity. The fact that the Soviets would continuously be in a position to dictate our actions to us, while we ourselves were unable to form reserves in time to ward off or anticipate his blows, would cause us excessive losses, not only of ground, but also of weapons and manpower. The prior condition for successfully prosecuting this struggle, we insisted, was a sufficiency of hard-hitting reserves. If these could not be transferred from other theatres, they must be created by radically shortening the front on the German southern wing, including a seaborne withdrawal of 17th Army from the Crimea. The army group could not last the winter if it had to fight without reserves. Up to the end of November, the situation on the southern wing of the Eastern Front developed as follows. South of the lower Dnieper, Army Group A, 6th Army's right wing had vanished behind the lower arm of the river, leaving only a narrow bridgehead at Kherson. 17th Army was cut off in the Crimea and barring the approaches to the peninsula. On the other hand, it had proved possible to maintain the bridgehead forward of Nikopol in its entire breadth, despite the fact that 4th Ukrainian Front, the responsible Soviet formation in the south, had committed its main forces, 18 divisions and strong armour, to the attack here. For the time being, the enemy had called a halt in front of the lower arm of the Dnieper and the Crimean approaches. In the Dnieper bend, he had been able to cross the river on a narrow front south of Zaporozhye and to form a small bridgehead. Otherwise, 1st Panzer Army's defensive tactics had been entirely successful, for although it had been pushed back slightly in some places as a result of the enemy's unremitting attacks, the latter had nowhere forced a breakthrough. Nonetheless, the fighting had compelled the army to commit its last reserves. At the end of November, it was holding a continuous front which ran from north of Zaporozhye to northwest of Krivoy Rog, where it bent round to the north to join up with 8th Army. 8th Army's own position had become very ticklish, partly, of course, because of the loss of the 1 infantry and 4 mobile divisions which it had had to hand over to 4th Panzer Army to cope with the situation at Kiev at the beginning of November. The enemy had been able to extend his firm base south of the Dnieper in the Kremenchug sector so far upstream that he now had control of the Kremenchug crossing point. Southwest of the town, moreover, he had punched a hole, however narrow it might be at the moment, in the army front facing east. On 8th Army's northern front on the Dnieper, the enemy had made a successful crossing on both sides of Cherkasy. Not having any reserves left, the army had been forced to abandon some 60 miles of riverbank and to set up a new, though extremely thin, defensive front behind a marshy watercourse which ran parallel to the Dnieper about 30 miles south of it. Although the army group had let 8th Army have 2 mobile formations from both 1st and 4th Panzer armies as soon as their positions permitted it to do so, it was doubtful whether 8th Army could close the gap in its eastern front and regain control of the situation at Cherkasy. This gives some idea of the extent to which the army group had to rush its armoured formations to and fro. Each attempt to restore the situation at one point by the use of mobile divisions inevitably provoked a crisis in the army area from which they had come. By the end of November, at all events, the line of the Dnieper from north of Zaporozhye to west of Cherkasy, and also from south of Kiev right up into Central Army Group's sector, was in enemy hands. On Southern Army Group's northern wing, in the area of 4th Panzer Army, the tension had temporarily relaxed after 48 Panzer Corps' successful counterstroke. Yet there could be no doubt whatever that the enemy was going to assemble fresh forces here and then deliver the decisive thrust into the deep flank of the army group. Despite this, the urgent need to continue the struggle for the Dnieper bend had made it imperative to return the 2 aforementioned mobile formations to 8th Army. At the beginning of December, 4th Panzer Army still had its right wing on the Dnieper, where its 24 Panzer Corps was in contact with the left wing of 8th Army upstream from the Kanev crossing. At that time, our Panzer Corps were by no means entirely made up of armoured divisions. They consisted of a Panzer Corps headquarters, with either infantry or armoured divisions under command, according to the prevailing situation. Author. Some 30 miles south of Kiev, the front swung sharply away from the river to the west and described a continuous line, 48 and 7 Panzer Corps and 13 Corps, as far as the region north of Zhytomyr. Some distance away, with a front facing east, was 59 Corps around Korostan. The Soviet attempts to force an issue in the Dnieper bend continued throughout December. Except for occasional pauses to substitute fresh formations for those which had grown battle-weary or to throw additional forces into the struggle, the enemy subjected this eastern bastion of ours to an unending succession of assaults which unquestionably caused him extremely heavy casualties. In the actual bend of the river, 3 Ukrainian front repeatedly attacked the northern front of 1st Panzer Army, 30 Corps and 57 Panzer Corps. But in spite of its immense preponderance of numbers, it did not achieve any success worth mentioning. Simultaneously, 2 Ukrainian front, hitherto known as the Steppes Front, put in no fewer than 6 rifle armies and 1 tank army in order to overrun the left wing of 1st Panzer Army and the 8th Army front facing east. The enemy clearly intended, by employing a massive concentration of armour, to break through to the southwest in the area northwest of Krivoy Rog, on the boundary between the 2 German armies. Having once achieved this, he would be able to encircle 1st Panzer Army in the east of the Dnieper Bend by driving on towards the lower arm of the river. A second area on which this offensive appeared to be focused was the northern part of 8th Army's eastern front south of the Dnieper. The enemy's aim here was presumably to bring about the encirclement of 8th Army, in conjunction with a sudden push from the bridgehead he had won at Cherkassy. At the same time, 3 armies of 4 Ukrainian front attacked the Nikopol bridgehead, which automatically included the rear of 1st Panzer Army, from the south. While these attacks were beaten off, the overwhelming superiority of 2 Ukrainian fronts' attack on the left wing of 1st Panzer Army inevitably brought the enemy certain successes against 8th Army. On 2 occasions, he succeeded in breaking through in considerable depth at the 2 main points of effort mentioned above. As a result, our front had to fall back gradually between Krivoy Rog, which could still be held, and the Dnieper. In both cases, the army group was able, though only by seriously weakening sectors which were temporarily less threatened, to assemble a panzer corps of several divisions at the spot in question, and, by counter-attacking the enemy breakthrough, to prevent it from affecting the operations as a whole. Yet it was unavoidable in this heavy fighting that the German formations should show increasing signs of battle fatigue. The infantry divisions were no longer getting a moment's respite, and the armoured forces had to be rushed like firefighters from one sector of the front to the next. While the enemy's own losses in killed and wounded were undoubtedly many times greater than our own, he was still able to replace them. On the other hand, none of the army group's attempts to convince the Supreme Command that it was operationally incorrect to use our forces in the Dnieper Bend produced any real results. OKH could not find the necessary replacements of personnel and material to compensate for the loss of fighting power, and Hitler refused to agree to a timely surrender of this bastion for the purpose of extracting forces to use on the operationally far more important northern wing. All our warnings that the present successes in defending the Dnieper Bend could not remove the danger of 1st Panzer Army's ultimate encirclement, as long as the enemy continued to bring up reinforcements, fell on deaf ears. So did our attempts to point out the urgency of forming reserves in the south by shortening the front. On the contrary, we had ultimately had no choice, as I have already mentioned, but to throw 2 divisions into the Dnieper Bend from the army group's northern wing, where they would have been far more usefully placed. It needed a desperate crisis on this northern wing before Hitler would face up, and even then most reluctantly, to these operational necessities. The reason which he continued to give for hanging on to the Dnieper Bend was the importance of Nikopol and the Crimea to our war effort. Even now he had not relinquished the hope that once the enemy attacks in the Dnieper Bend had been beaten off, it would be possible to strike another blow southwards to free the Crimea. What also influenced him here was doubtless the belief that the enemy would finally bleed to death, so long as he, Hitler, insisted on holding every foot of ground, just as he had done outside Moscow in 1941. Every time a shortening of the front was advocated, moreover, he repeatedly fell back on the quite irrefutable argument that this would release enemy formations as well. What Hitler chose to overlook was that although an attacker may bleed to death before an adequately defended front, any attempt to hold one which can at best be manned on the scale of a safety screen will merely cause the meagre defending forces to be expended at an excessive rate. Assuming, that is, that the enemy does not simply overrun them. On the northern wing of the army group, admittedly, the strokes delivered by 4th Panzer Army's 48 Panzer Corps had created a breathing space, but there could not be the slightest doubt that the enemy would resume the offensive there as soon as he had made good his losses. 4th Panzer Army's task must be to postpone that moment as long as possible by continuing to weaken its opponent. Furthermore, as the main forces of the army were now disposed along a front facing north between the Dnieper and the region north of Zhytomyr, there was as much danger as ever that the enemy would try to outflank its western wing, a manoeuvre which 59 Corps, isolated around Korostan, was in no position to prevent. as 4th Panzer Army's forces were in any case insufficient to dislodge the enemy completely from the western bank of the Dnieper by an attack towards Kiev. The army group felt it must at least try to create a margin of safety for the army's western wing. The longer it was possible to retain the initiative regained there by 48 Panzer Corps, the better it would be. 4th Panzer Army was accordingly directed to exploit the situation on the now open western wing in the Zhytomyr-Korostan area, with a view to launching further offensive blows against limited objectives. On Army Group instructions, 48 Panzer Corps was taken out of the front facing north, and by the use of extensive camouflage and deception tactics, moved by night into the open western flank of the enemy's 60th Army north of Zhytomyr. In the surprise attack that followed, the latter was rolled up from the west. Immediately afterwards, the corps struck another blow at an enemy force in the process of grouping southeast of Korostan, in the course of which at least 3 mechanized corps were badly mauled. Eventually, then, it was possible not only to smash parts of the new offensive group before it could finish forming west of the Dnieper, but also to re-establish a certain degree of control over the area opposite 4th Panzer Army's left wing. This did not alter the fact that another serious storm was brewing on the same wing of the army group. It broke loose on 24th December. I received the first reports of the start of an enemy attack on both sides of the Kiev-Zhytomyr road while I was visiting 20 Panzer Grenadier Division, which was in reserve behind the threatened front. I was there to attend the Christmas celebrations of its regiments. At first, the news did not sound any too serious, the only area where things looked at all precarious being that of 25 Panzer Division south of the road. However, the evening situation reports which I saw on arriving back at our headquarters in Vinitsa indicated that the enemy was attempting a large-scale breakthrough towards Zhytomyr. In the next few days, the following intelligence picture emerged. One Ukrainian front in the Kiev sector had concentrated very powerful forces west of the town for a broad breakthrough along and south of the Zhytomyr road. In this main assault group were 38th, 1st Guards and 1st Tank Armies, initially embracing over 18 rifle divisions and 6 tank or mechanized corps. Within the next few days, 18th Army was also identified. This main attack was extended southwards by 40th Army south of Fastov. On the northern wing of the assault front, the recently beaten 60th Army, since brought up to strength, and further north 13th Army, were advancing on Korostan with at least 14 rifle divisions and 1 cavalry corps under command. While some of these forces had been severely weakened in the aforementioned attack by our 48 Panzer Corps, 3rd Guards Tank Army, with a strength of no less than 6 tank or mechanized corps, appeared to be busy assembling behind them. Admittedly, 3 or 4 of these corps, too, had been badly hit in the recent fighting, but the Hydra lost no time in sprouting new heads. Anyway, this concentration of mobile formations implied that the enemy intended to supplement the breakthrough towards Zhytomyr with a far-flung outflanking movement by way of Korostan. It is true that 48 Panzer Corps, consisting of 2 hard-hitting armoured divisions, 168 Infantry Division and 18 Artillery Division, newly formed in the Army Group area, was being held in readiness around Zhytomyr, behind the most badly threatened sector of front, now commanded by 42 Corps. It was open to doubt, however, whether these forces would suffice to halt a thrust by an enemy so many times stronger than themselves. And even if they should do so, there would still not be enough forces to meet the threat of an enemy thrust through Korostan, followed by an envelopment of the Army Group's northern wing. On 25th December, therefore, the Army Group sent OKH a teleprinter message outlining our own position in relation to the enemy's and pointing out what inferences were to be drawn. With the forces it had at present, we reported, 4th Panzer Army could not stop the enemy offensive, which meant that it could not fulfill its task of covering the deep flank of Southern Army Group and Army Group A. Consequently, the army must be radically reinforced. If OKH had no more forces for this purpose, the Army Group would be compelled to detach at least 5 or 6 divisions from its right wing. In that event, the latter obviously could not remain its present position in the Dnieper Bend, and we must accordingly request that it be granted freedom of action. At the same time, 4th Panzer Army was directed in the first instance to use all its available forces to stop the main Soviet assault group from breaking through towards Zhytomyr in 42 Corps' sector. Its northern wing, 13 and 59 Corps, the army was told, must engage the enemy in such a way that he was prevented from turning down on Zhytomyr. 17. Panzer Division, already released from 6th Army, which had temporarily reverted to the Army Group's command, on the lower Dnieper, was moved over to 4th Panzer Army. In reply to a further inquiry from OKH, which, doubtless at the instance of Hitler, was again directed at obtaining a compromise solution in the Dnieper Bend, the Army Group reported that the time for attempting to master the situation on the Army Group's northern wing by such isolated measures as the transfer of single divisions is now past. To judge from the size of the force which the enemy had committed up there, we said not even a temporary stoppage of his offensive could make any difference now, particularly as he would certainly be throwing further elements of his winter reserves into the battle. In fact, the position was such that developments in the area Korosten, Zhytomyr, Berdychev, Vinnytsia south of Kiev in the next few weeks would decide whether or not the southern wing of the German armies in the east would be cut off and forced away to the southwest. It was imperative that energetic measures be taken to counteract this danger. The situation was similar to that in which the Army Group had found itself during the winter of 1942-3, when the only possible means of repairing the front had been to leapfrog 1st and 4th Panzer armies from the right to the left wing. What must be done now was to release 1st Panzer Army from the Dnieper Bend and shift it over towards Berdychev with at least 5 or 6 divisions. This could only be achieved by giving up the eastern part of the Dnieper Bend and taking the front there back into prepared positions on a line running from the knee of the Dnieper west of Nikopol to Krivoy Rog. By shortening the front in this way, we explained, we should be saving 12 divisions. 6 of them, as already stated, were to be sent to 1st Panzer Army on the Army Group's northern wing. The remainder were to be left to 6th Army, which was to take over what had hitherto been 1st Panzer Army's sector, for the purpose of establishing a defence on the lower Dnieper. The forces to be thrown over to the northern wing of the Army Group were as far as possible to be directed from the east against the enemy spearhead breaking through to Zhytomyr. In addition, OKH would have to send further forces to the northern wing of the Army Group to intercept the enemy outflanking movement which threatened there. Later, if possible, these forces would be used from the west to supplement 1st Panzer Army's attack on the main assault group. We also pointed out that while the present situation in the Dnieper Bend, where the enemy's attacks had temporarily slackened off, would permit this regrouping to take place without any great risk, the proposed withdrawal of the front was liable to prove difficult if we waited until the enemy was again ready to attack there. In view of the above, as well as of 4th Panzer Army's own position, we concluded it was essential that the Supreme Command make a quick decision. When, despite promptings from us, there was still no decision on this proposal by 28th of December, but merely the promise of 1 or 2 divisions for 4th Panzer Army, the Army Group issued the appropriate orders on 29th of December. HQ 1st Panzer Army was to hand over its present sector to 6th Army by 1st January, and by 3rd January at the latest, to take over 4th Panzer Armies, i.e. 24 Panzer and 7 Corps, front running from the Dnieper to a point some 27 miles southeast of Berdychev. Behind the left wing of this front, 3 Panzer Corps was to assemble with 4 divisions drawn from the Dnieper Bend, or 6th Army, 6 and 17 Panzer Divisions, 16 Panzer Grenadier Division, and 101 Light Jaeger Division. Other divisions would follow. One reason why this switch of 1st Panzer Army was not initiated on an even larger scale was the limited availability of transport. Another, however, was that the Army Group could not order the evacuation of the eastern part of the Dnieper Bend without Hitler's consent, as it was bound to have direct repercussions on the position of Army Group A. Even at Army Group level, unfortunately, the possibility of taking decisions independently of the Supreme Command ends, where the power to coordinate operations between the army groups begins. To the stretch of front remaining to 4th Panzer Army were to come the forces put at its disposal by OKH, HQ 46 Corps, with 16 Panzer Division, 1 Infantry Division, and 4 Mountain Division under command. It remained doubtful, however, whether these would suffice for the 2 counterblows planned against the flanks of the main enemy assault group driving towards the southwest. The first thing, in any case, was to bring the enemy to a standstill. On 30th of December, the Army Group reported the steps it had taken to OKH, and the following day Hitler belatedly gave his consent. On the other hand, he continued to evade the urgently needed decision to give up the eastern part of the Dnieper Bend, and with it the bridgehead of Nikopol. While the transfer of forces ordered by the Army Group was being set in motion, the situation in 4th Panzer Army's sector became increasingly ominous by 31st December. The main enemy assault group had achieved a wide breakthrough to the southwest in the direction of Vinitsa. Although the army's front south of Kiev, 24 Panzer and 7 Corps, was still holding, it had had to bend back its western wing considerably. Beyond it, in the area where 3 Panzer Corps was supposed to assemble, there was a gaping void 50 miles wide. Not until a point less than 30 miles southeast of Berdichev did another thin front belonging to 4th Panzer Army begin, and even this, running hard east of the road from Berdichev to Zhytomyr, petered out again north of the latter. Fighting around Zhytomyr, with a front facing north and east, was 13 Corps. Between it and 59 Corps, which had been pushed back to the west of Korostin, yawned another 50-mile gap in which, some distance to the rear, 26 Panzer Corps was to concentrate. Fortunately, the opposing forces were temporarily engaged against the disconnected groups of 4th Panzer Army described above. As for the broad gaps between them, the enemy had so far not fully exploited, or else entirely failed to appreciate, the chances they offered his mobile elements of driving straight through to the Army Group's rear areas, or else of surrounding 4th Panzer Army. At the beginning of January, the position of the Army Group as a whole grew progressively worse. In the Dnieper Bend, and this also applied to the Nikopol bridgehead, a fresh offensive was being prepared against 6th and 8th Armies. Should it break loose before the eastern part of the river bend had been relinquished in accordance with the Army Group's demand, the situation of this wing could become extremely grave. Worst of all, it would no longer be possible to disengage the armoured divisions which were to follow HQ. 1st Panzer Army to the northern wing as a second wave, and whose release had already been ordered by the Army Group. A major enemy attack did in fact materialise east of Kirovograd on 3rd January, and the 2 divisions there were stuck for the time being. All this time it was becoming increasingly urgent that the northern wing should be supplied with further forces, the enemy having meanwhile recognised the big opportunity offered to him by the gaps torn in 4th Panzer Army's front. In what was now the area of 1st Panzer Army, the headquarters of which had assumed command in the sector south and southwest of Kiev with effect from 3rd January, the enemy pushed southwards to a point some 30 miles north of Uman. Here he was provisionally halted by the arrival of 3 Panzer Corps' forward elements. A particularly serious situation had arisen in 4th Panzer Army. Faced with the danger of having both wings outflanked, it had by 4th January been compelled to fall back onto a front which began less than 40 miles east of Vinitsa and ran north towards Berdichev, for which a battle was already in progress, finally ending about 40 miles west of the town on the former Soviet-Polish frontier. In the broad gap between ourselves and Central Army Group further north, 59 Corps had gone back to the former frontier along and north of the highway from Zhytomyr to Rovno. These developments during the first few days of the month impelled me to fly to Hitler's headquarters on 4th January to try to persuade him once and for all of the need for a radical transposition of forces from the right to the left wing of the Army Group. I began by describing the new danger threatening us in the Dnieper Bend, and the exceedingly critical state of affairs in the area of 4th Panzer Army. Next, I gave a detailed explanation of our plan to take the enemy harassing this army in his flanks by attacking with 1st Panzer Army's 3 Panzer Corps from the east, and with 26 Panzer Corps, now arriving behind 4th Panzer Army's northern wing from the northwest. At the same time, I warned Hitler that the most these projected counterattacks could do would be to provide a purely temporary relief from the immediate danger which threatened. From a long-term point of view, they offered no solution to the situation on the Army Group's northern wing. If the position here were not cleared up once and for all, the entire southern wing of the Eastern Front would be in mortal peril, and Southern Army Group and Army Group A would ultimately meet their end in Romania or on the Black Sea. If the Supreme Command, therefore, did not provide substantial reinforcements, it would no longer be possible to put off withdrawing the southern wing of the Army Group, which would mean abandoning Nikopol and ipso facto the Crimea for the purpose of extracting forces for the decisive northern wing. I ought to point out at this stage that the Army Group regarded a withdrawal from the east of the Dnieper Bend as only the first step towards transposing the main effort to the northern wing on a scale consistent with the overall situation. In order to regroup to that extent, it would be necessary to shorten the front in the south far more radically. For this reason, the Army Group had already taken the precaution of having a defence line further west reconnoitred and developed, a fact of which Hitler was naturally aware. Taking advantage of favourable stretches of river, this line ran in a more or less northerly or northwesterly direction from the lower reaches of the Bug to the southern extremities of the area in which the battles of the Army Group's northern wing were at present raging. Occupation of this line would roughly halve the length of front being held by 6th and 8th Armies, which had now been stretched to 560 miles through the continued retention of the Dnieper Bend. By cutting our frontage as drastically as this and saving really substantial forces, coupled with the transfer of 17th Army from the Crimea to the mainland, we should at last be able to shift our main effort to our northern wing. At the same time, the southern wing would still be left with enough forces to hold the aforementioned line against a far superior opponent. On the other hand, in view of the damage we had done to his railway network, the enemy would scarcely be capable of shifting forces from his own southern wing into the area west of Kiev at the same speed and on the same scale as we could. The basis for such a sweeping withdrawal of the German southern wing, of course, first had to be created by the evacuation of the Dnieper Bend. To have demanded it straight off would have been most inexpedient in view of what we knew Hitler's attitude to be. He just was not the man to recognize the need for a far-sighted operational policy. On the contrary, Hitler even now categorically refused to evacuate the Dnieper Bend or to give up Nikopol, as he contended that the resultant loss of the Crimea would provoke a change of heart in Turkey, as well as in Bulgaria and Romania. He went on to declare that he was in no position to let the Army Group have any further forces for its northern wing, as he would at best be able to take these from Northern Army Group, and then only by pulling it back to Lake Peipus. This might lead to the defection of Finland, which would in turn lose us mastery of the Baltic. Thereafter, it would no longer be possible to bring ore from Sweden, and our U-boats would be deprived of a vital training area. As for giving us forces from the west, said Hitler, he could not do this until an enemy landing had first been beaten off, or the British did as he expected and tied themselves down in Portugal. What he must do was to play for time until things clarified in the west, and our new formations were ready to go into action. From May onwards, moreover, submarine warfare would begin to make its effect felt. There were so many disagreements on the enemy side, Hitler added, that the coalition was bound to fall apart one day. To gain time was therefore a matter of paramount importance. While he took just as grave a view as I did of the threat to my Army Group, he had to accept a risk here until he had more forces at his disposal. It was quite futile to attempt to refute Hitler's arguments, since he would merely retort, as he could usually do in such cases, that I lacked an overall perspective. All I could do was to keep referring to the gravity of the situation on our northern wing, and to emphasize that the countermeasures being taken by the Army Group could not possibly offer a final solution to the crisis. It was absolutely imperative that in some way or other a new army be swiftly assembled behind the northern wing of the army group, roughly in the region of Rovno, to meet the threat of a large-scale envelopment by the enemy. As there could be no point in prolonging this discussion with Hitler in front of the large number of people who attended the daily conference, I asked to see him privately, with only the Chief of Staff present. Obviously wondering what I was going to bring up this time, Hitler reluctantly gave his consent, and the emissaries of OKW and Goering, the various aides, Hitler's historiographer, and the 2 stenographers duly departed. Normally, the stenographers had to take down every word at these daily meetings. Having no maps in front of them, however, they often could not grasp the sense of all that was said. I had flown to General Headquarters with the firm intention of raising the question of the top-level military leadership again, in addition to discussing the position of my army group. As soon as everyone but General Zeitzler had left the room, I asked leave to speak quite openly. "Please do," said Hitler. His manner, if not actually icy, was certainly distant. "One thing we must be clear about, mein Führer," I began, "is that the extremely critical situation we are now in cannot be put down to the enemy's superiority alone, great though it is. It is also due to the way in which we are led." As I spoke these words, Hitler's expression hardened. He stared at me with a look which made me feel he wished to crush my will to continue. I cannot remember a human gaze ever conveying such willpower. In his otherwise coarse face, the eyes were probably the only attractive and certainly the most expressive feature, and now they were boring into me as if to force me to my knees. At the same moment, the notion of an Indian snake charmer flashed through my mind, and I realized that those eyes must have intimidated many a man before me. I still went on talking, however, and told Hitler that things simply could not go on under the present type of leadership. I must, I said, revert to the proposal I had made to him twice already. To handle grand strategy, he needed one thoroughly responsible chief of staff on whose advice alone he must rely in all matters of military policy. The logical effect of this arrangement on the Eastern Front must be, as was already the case in Italy and the West, the appointment of a commander-in-chief enjoying full independence within the framework of grand strategy. As had happened on the 2 previous occasions when I had approached Hitler about the need for a radical change in his handling of military affairs, amounting in practice, if not formally, to his relinquishment of command, he reacted entirely negatively, asserting that he alone could decide what forces were available for the various theatres of war and what policies should be pursued there. In any case, he said, Goering would never submit to another man's orders. As regards the proposed appointment of a commander-in-chief for the Eastern theatre of war, I have already quoted Hitler's retort that no other man would have the same authority as he had. "Even I cannot get the field marshals to obey me," he cried. "Do you imagine, for example, that they would obey you any more readily? If it comes to the worst, I can dismiss them. No one else would have the authority to do that." When I replied that my orders were always carried out, he made no further comment and brought the meeting to a close. Once again, then, I had failed in a well-disposed attempt to persuade Hitler to change the system of command at the top in such a way as to satisfy the exigencies of the war without outwardly affecting his prestige. His unwillingness to hand over to a soldier was probably due in part to his exaggerated faith in his own powers. Not even in private would he admit to having made mistakes or to being in need of a military adviser. Another cause was probably the mistrust which made the dictator determined to keep the army under his control against any contingency. On the other hand, I was well aware that any attempt to settle the matter by force would lead to the collapse of our armies in the field. As far as I was concerned, the prospect of the Russians getting into Germany excluded the use of violent means just as much as the Anglo-Saxon demand for unconditional surrender. And so I had to return to my headquarters without having been able to get the army group's position alleviated or to bring about a rational organization of command at the top. On no account, however, were we going to abandon our efforts to gain freedom of movement for our right wing in the Dnieper Bend and to reinforce our wing in the north. In view of the negative outcome of the conference at Hitler's headquarters, the army group was left with no choice but to carry on with the struggle in the Dnieper Bend. On its northern wing, operations had to be conducted in such a way as to prevent the enemy from encircling 4th Panzer Army and breaking through to the south, which would result in the severance of all the southern wing's rear communications. Throughout January, the enemy in the Dnieper Bend continued to pit all his strength against the bastion we were still having to hold there. In doing so, he assailed 8th Army's eastern front with particular fury, though the sector now commanded by 6th Army also had to fight off repeated attacks. The latter were directed not only against the front facing north inside the river bend, but also from the south against the Nikopol bridgehead. Thanks to the heroism of the German troops and the numerous stopgaps devised by the two army commands, the enemy in this combat area continued to have only limited success, despite the fact that he was now many times stronger in numbers and material. Although 8th Army's front was pushed back a little to the west and Kirovograd was abandoned, the enemy still did not accomplish a decisive breakthrough for the purpose of trapping our forces in the Dnieper Bend. On the army group's left wing, on the other hand, the situation was becoming more and more difficult. 4th Panzer Army, unable to withstand the intensive enemy pressure, found itself compelled to give up Berdichev and, in order to preserve a minimum degree of continuity on the main part of its front, to fall back further still to the west and southwest. But that was not the worst of it. What constituted an infinitely greater danger was that around 6th of January, the enemy had realized what opportunities were offered to him by the gap between 1st Panzer Army and the right wing of 4th Panzer Army, as well as by the wide open space which had appeared between 4th Panzer Army and Central Army Group. Inside the latter, a weak solitary 59 Corps was making a fighting withdrawal towards Rovno. It became clear that the enemy had now halted along the front of 4th Panzer Army in order to exploit his chances in its exposed flanks. While he sought to demolish 4th Panzer Army's northern wing with 3 armies, 18th, 1st Guards and 1st Guards Tank, he dispatched his 60th and 13th Armies on a pursuit to Rovno further north. At the same time, strong Soviet forces, 1st Tank and 40th Armies, drove further southwards in the gap between our own 1st and 4th Panzer Armies. Their spearheads got to about 20 miles north of Uman, the supply base of 1st Panzer Army, and close to Vinitsa, where Army Group headquarters had previously been. The latter had been transferred to Proskurov a few days earlier when the signals links with the Army Group's right wing were endangered by the sudden Soviet push. Eventually, enemy armour even succeeded in temporarily blocking the most important of the Army Group's railway supply lines at Jmerinka. Those further south ran through Romanian territory and had a lower efficiency. In this situation, the Army Group had to choose between two courses. Should it take steps to counteract a further enemy thrust in its almost wide-open northern flank, where there was an inherent possibility of a far-flung outflanking movement round its northern wing later on? Or was it more important to prevent the enemy's final breakthrough in the gap between 1st Panzer and 4th Panzer armies? There were insufficient forces available to discharge both tasks at once. We resolved to tackle the second danger first, as the more pressing of the two. If the enemy were allowed to drive through this gap in strength and to head south towards the upper Bug, 8th and 6th Armies would face an imminent threat of being cut off. Conversely, a continuation of the enemy's advance in the Army Group's northern flank would not constitute a direct threat to our existence until some time in the less immediate future. Up here, a certain relief would ultimately be provided by the forces which Hitler would sooner or later be compelled to bring up. If, on the other hand, the two armies of the southern wing were once cut off, there would no longer be any possibility of extricating them. The only correct solution, an extensive withdrawal of the Army Group's southern wing for the sake of gaining forces to overcome the crisis on the northern one, was still categorically vetoed by Hitler. In the light of these considerations, we decided first of all to concentrate all the forces that could possibly be spared for a stroke against the enemy advancing southwards in the gap between 1st Panzer and 4th Panzer armies. This gap was rendered even more dangerous by the fact that the enemy's breakthrough in the direction of Uman had forced 1st Panzer Army to bend its western wing in the area southwest of Kiev back to the south. It now stood back-to-back, so to speak, with 8th Army, which had its front facing eastwards in the Dnieper bend. As the inner wings of both armies still held the Dnieper on either side of Kanev, the German position formed a sort of sack, of which the top was hitched to the Dnieper in the north, and the two sides formed the above-mentioned fronts of the two armies, facing east and west respectively. If the enemy in the gap north of Uman were successful, it would be only too easy for him to isolate this sack in the south. The most sensible thing, of course, would have been to evacuate it, since forces were being unprofitably used on its defence. But here, too, Hitler was on no account prepared to see the Dnieper bank abandoned voluntarily. He was still hoping that by using this salient as a springboard, he would one day be able to recapture the eastern part of the Dnieper bend, and so the sack remained in existence. Not very long afterwards, it became the Cherkasy pocket. The army group intended that the blow to be struck at the enemy advancing between 4th and 1st Panzer armies should take the form of a three-pronged pincer attack. From the east, out of 1st Panzer Army's sector, 7 Corps had to thrust into the enemy's flank. It was released from the above-mentioned salient by an army group order laying down that only a weak defensive screen should remain on the Dnieper. This measure paid off insofar as the corps was not caught in the Cherkasy pocket later on. From the west, 46 Panzer Corps was to drive into the other flank. At this moment it was still on its way over from France. From the south, 3 Panzer Corps, released by the army group from the Dnieper bend, was thrown in to meet the enemy. Its task was to hold him down by mobile fighting until the 2 other corps were ready to attack. By the second half of January, everything was set for the counterblow. Because of the small number of formations available, however, it had to be carried out in 2 phases, the gap between 4th and 1st Panzer armies having meanwhile widened to almost 45 miles. In the first instance, 7 Corps and 3 Panzer Corps defeated 40th Soviet Army in the eastern part of the gap. Thereafter, as the result of another concentric attack by 3 and 26 Panzer Corps in which 1 infantry division, 4 mountain division and 18 artillery division played a substantial part, appreciable elements of the enemy's 1st Tank Army were surrounded and smashed in the west of the gap. During the latter attack, I no longer possess the figures for the first one, approximately 5,000 Soviet troops were killed, and though only 5,500 were taken prisoner, the enemy lost 700 tanks, more than 200 field guns and around 500 anti-tank guns. 14 Soviet infantry divisions and 5 tank or mechanized corps had been affected by the 2 strokes, though the enemy had doubtless managed to save at least a part of his troops from encirclement. While all this was taking place, of course, the controversy between Army Group and OKH on the question of future operations continued. Time after time we stressed the importance of finally granting freedom of movement to our right wing and ceasing to clamp it down in the Dnieper bend, which had long been an improper policy from the operational point of view. In a letter submitted through the Chief of the General Staff, I took Hitler up on the arguments he had given me on 4th of January for holding fast to the Dnieper bend. The attitudes of Turkey, Bulgaria and Romania, I told him, would depend less on the Crimea than the presence of an intact German southern wing forward of the eastern frontier of the 2 last-named countries. The Army Group was also at pains to emphasize that the final issue on the whole of the German southern wing would depend on the timely assembly of a strong army around Rovno, behind the Army Group's left wing, whether this was done by disengaging forces from the right wing after pulling it back onto a shortened front, by transferring formations down from Northern Army Group, or by evacuating 17th Army from the Crimea. Only if we could assemble this army around Rovno in good time, we said, could the enemy be prevented from executing a wide envelopment movement in our northern flank, and thereby from forcing the entire southern wing of our eastern front away to Romania. While the Chief of Staff entirely concurred with our views and made repeated efforts to get Hitler to listen to them, the latter stuck to his principle of stubbornly holding on at all costs. It was impossible to obtain a directive on how he proposed to conduct operations on a longer-term basis, i.e., further than holding on for the next 24 hours. What made this sort of leadership more irrational than ever was the fact that even OKH credited the enemy with still having powerful strategic reserves at his disposal, which he must be expected to commit sooner or later. How could anyone exercise proper command in the field when Hitler did not even tell the army groups how he conceived the future of operations generally? How, if those enemy reserves actually did exist, was their intervention to be anticipated with any degree of foresight? This impossible state of affairs was the subject of a letter in which I stated the following: If any leadership is to be successful, it must be based on a harmonious coordination of policy at all levels, which is dependent on clear directives from the top and a unanimous appreciation of the situation obtaining on the enemy's side. The army group cannot merely think from one day to the next. It cannot make do with a directive to hold on regardless, when at the very same time it sees the enemy preparing to force the issue by an outflanking movement which it has no means of opposing. I must therefore request OKH either to accept the Army Group's views on the basis of the appreciations already submitted, or else to refute them by passing down its own appreciation of future developments. If the Supreme Command remains dumb as well as deaf to the conclusions drawn by the Army Group in its own limited sphere of activity, a coordinated policy will be quite out of the question. When there was no reply to this either, I wrote a long letter to Hitler personally. Once again, I pointed out the situation of the Army Group, the operational possibilities open to the enemy, and the state of our own troops,